Hello, welcome to Mind Chat. My name's Philip Goff.
Hello, welcome to Mind Chat. My name's Keith Frankish.
How are you doing, Keith?
I'm good. I'm okay.
It's been about 3 days since I last saw you.
Yes, what's been happening? Converted to any new religion? Zoroastrianism, maybe?
I'm still suffering from the backlash of me coming out as a heretical Christian, which we talked about last time. There's been about 8 response videos thus far, and they seem to have come in 2 waves. The first wave was all the traditional Christians saying I'm not really a Christian, and then now there's been a new wave of atheists saying, "What the hell are you talking about all this nonsense?" So as usual, everyone hates me, but it's
You've got to build the Goffian community.
No one ever agrees with me, but never mind. You plod on. What have you been up to?
In the last 3 days. Of course, it may be more than 3 days since viewers have seen it because this is a pre-record. The usual things. I've got 1 or 2 projects actually, which I will tell you about, or just tell the world about in due time. But for the moment, I'll be mysterious about this. So,
I'm intrigued. That is very mysterious.
Yes, you don't know what to expect, do you? Dropping a little hint here about our guest today.
Well, you want to know what's coming up on Mind Chat then, Professor Frankish?
I do indeed, Professor Goff.
Well, we've got our world-famous Christmas special coming up very soon, next month, with Angela Mendelevici and Pete Mandic debating the views we have, obviously one of which is correct and one of which is incorrect. So we'll get other people to do it because people are bored of listening to us. And Peter Godfrey Smith lined up in for the new year. We're still fixing a date for that, but that's going to be coming up, and lots more exciting guests. So please do subscribe, comment, support us on Patreon to help get this out to a broader audience. But
exciting guests.
Do you know what we've got today, Keith?
I predict I'm going to enjoy this.
Well, last time we had Annika Harris, who agrees with everything I say. I mean, not because I say it, just we happen to think all the same things. So I thought it's about time we had someone who agrees with you a bit. Not entirely. I think there's still going to be some scope for disagreement, but someone a little bit on your side of the physicalist side of things. It's an old friend, catching up with an old friend. None other than Andy Clark. Andy Clark, welcome to Mind Chat.
Oh, welcome, Andy.
Hi.
Wonderful to have you.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
It's
very
great to have
good
you
to
on.
see you. Well, Andy, you're an influential pioneer in the field. I'm sure most people listening to this will have heard something about you already, but just in case there are some people who've been living on Mars for a couple of decades who haven't heard about you, would you like to tell us, viewers and listeners, a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, delighted to. So I'm Andy Clark. I'm a professor of cognitive philosophy at the University of Sussex. And I think what the cognitive means in there is that they weren't really quite sure where to put me. And so I'm half appointed in informatics and half in philosophy. And that pretty well reflects the kind of stuff that I do, because throughout my career, I've been interested in scientific accounts of how minds work. Basically, I do what you might call philosophy of cognitive science. Anything that science can tell us about how minds might work, I sort of try to look at it. Sometimes I collaborate with people that are actually working in the field, try and get my hands as dirty as a philosopher reasonably can, and have been very interested in topics like artificial neural networks, then embodied cognition, then extended cognition, and most lately, so-called predictive processing, a kind of somewhat neurocentric model of how it might all come together. So that's kind of where I am.
Fantastic. I should say that throughout the...
When I say neurocentric, I don't mean it's really neurocentric, by the way. We'll come to this. I just mean that, it starts off as a model of what brains do.
Yeah. I should say that so long as I've been in philosophy, Andy has always been the person who, to me, is the pioneer. He's the one out ahead of the crowd. If you want to know where things are going, going in 10 years' time. Look at what Andy Clark's doing now. That's what I've always. I,
Gardening.
That was that was reflected a little bit in one of our audience questions that we'll get to later, but I think that's quite a common perception.
Well, Andy, you've written many books, many academic papers, but your new book, which was out just last year, in a way, it brings together a lot of the themes and presents them for a wide readership. And it's called The Experience Machine, title I love. And the subtitle is How Our Minds Predict and Shape Realities. That's a big, bold title, the machine, how the machine produces experience. And it's to do with this notion of prediction, which you mentioned, predictive processing. So I guess the two big themes of the book that it brings together is this notion of predictive processing, and then how that relates to another big theme of your work, which is how the mind extends beyond the brain, or can extend beyond the brain.
Yeah.
So can we just begin by getting into those key ideas? Well, first with the predictive processing. For people who are not familiar with this, what's the easiest way into this idea? Because it's in some ways, it's quite I was going to say revolutionary, I suppose it is, take on the mind. It reverses the traditional picture of how perception works, doesn't it?
Yes, in a way it does. So, I often ponder what's the best way into this set of ideas. I'm still not sure.
Mm-hmm.
The core idea is that nothing in experience is ever raw in a broad sense. Experience always arises at the meeting point of the predictions that the brain is making about what kind of sensory information is likely to be coming in right now, and the actual sensory information that's coming in right now. And so when those two things meet, what follows in the end is human experience. Importantly, they don't always meet in quite the same way either. So it's not that there's one simple account here of how predictions meet sensory evidence. Instead, that's modulated by various other processes that we're going to talk about, I'm sure. But as for a good way in, well, maybe examples are normally a good way in.
Mm-hmm.
So many people might have experienced the Green Needle brainstorm audio files. If you haven't, then just a quick Google, Green Needle brainstorm. And what you'll see and hear is the same audio file played again and again with somebody, many different somebodies on the web, normally doing something like holding up a placard that either says Green Needle or it says brainstorm, or both words are there and they're pointing to one, something like that. Anyway, what you'll then experience is a radically different hearing. The sound stream, which is exactly the same, will sometimes sound to you just like Green Needle, other times just like brainstorm. So it's a bistable experience, if you like, that seems to be generated by the weight of evidence. When you sort of point to the word, you're adding a little bit more weight to the evidence that would get you Green Needle rather than brainstorm. But your experience isn't really like that. It's not like I'm experiencing something very unclear and now I got a little bit more evidence this way. Instead, it just jumps out in experience. And I think that's a weird little case, but it's just a demo. But the core idea is that all human experience is constructed that way. If you're in the shower and you hear a familiar song, it sounds much, much clearer to you than an unfamiliar song in the shower. That's because your brain commands very, very good predictions about that song. It's got a good generative model, to use the current lingo, of that particular audio stream. And under those conditions, the audio stream really is clearer. It's not that memory is adding something else in. Instead, this is just how experience is constructed. We use what we already know to sort and clean up and amplify and dampen bits of the sensory signal until a structured world comes into view. That's kind of the idea. There are loads of examples. I'm sure we'll be given lots during the talk. But what I found, or the discussion, what I found is that when you start to think about your experience this way, a lot of things will begin to fall into place.
So would this be a fair way of putting it, that what our brain is trying to do is not so much to model what's happening at this instant, but what's going to happen. It's kind of, our experience is anticipatory. Is that the idea? We're living in the world we expect.
Kind of yes and kind of no, but I think it's better to say the no-ish bits first.
Okay.
So although it's called predictive processing, an awful lot of what's going on here is predicting the present.
Right.
So although having a grip on how things unfold into the future is a very good way of predicting the present, the general idea is that your experience of the present moment is your brain's best guess at how the present moment is likely to be constructed. And that best guess, the prediction, if you like, gets modulated by incoming sensory information. There's rapid bouts of reciprocal exchange through many, many brain areas, and then you settle into a coherent percept of the world, a coherent experience. So it's not, although anticipation is in there, anticipation isn't the core. Predicting the present is the core of the story.
When you say predicting the present, you mean the incoming stream of sensory data? Is that
Not quite. And yes, that's the other thing that I should have said. So what's going on when you crunch together these two sources of information, the predictions and the raw sensory energies that are coming at the body, vibrations in the air, for example, and light waves reflecting off of objects, these sorts of things, surface reflectances. What your brain is trying to do, if these accounts are correct, and actually this is shared with many accounts, so I think this bit is correct, is trying to guess at the shape of the distal world. So it's trying to guess at what's out there that is the most likely cause of the current overall state of evidence, where the overall state of evidence is what are the raw energies coming in and what predictions have I got about the shape they should be taking. But all of that is in the service of just one thing, which is trying to guess how things are out there. So you're not trying to predict the sensory stream exactly, because brains don't care about the sensory stream. They care about tables and chairs and apples and oranges, things like that. So we will again and again come back, I think, to the idea that brains are, if you like, something like salience and significance engines. What they're about is using those sources of information, anything they can lay their brainy hands on, in order to guess not just what's out there, but most importantly, what's significant about what's out there. And indeed about what's in here, because we experience our bodies and selves in just the same way.
And that's a very important aspect of your book, which we must come back to. So is it something like this then, that the brain is trying to track the bits of the world that are important to it, trying to lock onto those, and it's trying to model? When you talk about prediction, would it be okay to say it's trying to model their dynamics, how they're unfolding, how these significant aspects of the world are unfolding around it, so that it can?
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's dynamics all the way. So, these are unfolding processes in us that are trying to put us on top of unfolding processes in the world, and indeed in us, in our, guts and heart and legs as well. So yeah, it's processes all the way, I think.
Right. But now that's more the sensory side, but there is a side that definitely is about prediction, isn't it? Which is more forward-looking, which is when we try to put action into this picture. So because that's one of the really nice things about this story, is that about this predictive processing framework, is that it uses the same framework to explain both perception and action. Yeah. So maybe you could tell us a bit about that. And that, of course, will bring in the idea of monitoring the body, won't it?
It will eventually. Yeah. But yes, I mean, I'd be very happy to talk about that, because in many ways, that's the biggest attraction of this framework for me. The big attraction of this framework, which I should stress, this is still a speculative framework. There's, there are interesting bodies of evidence, but whether this is just part of the story, or perhaps a sort of dimly glimpsed version of the whole story, or no part of the story at all. I think all of that is still up for grabs. So I would put a lot of money on it being at least part of the story. But yes, going back to action and perception, the core idea there is that in action, we are actually trying to make the world and body conform to our own predictions. So if I want to reach out and pick up this, it's not in view, this can of kombucha that I happen to have in front of me, then what the brain is busy doing on these accounts is predicting the flow of sensory information that I would be getting from my body if it was making the right movements to reach out and pick up this can. Because it's not already making those movements, you get a flow of something we've not talked about yet, prediction errors. Prediction errors are absolutely crucial in these stories because they're, on the normal sensory side, they're what keeps us anchored to the world. I can predict all I like, but the world ain't always going to be the way I expect it to be. And so you need to do something about that. And that something is a flow of errors that are calculated where the prediction meets the sensory evidence. And that is then used to try and retrieve better predictions, for example. That's in the sort of ordinary sensory case.
Right.
In the case of action, it's this subset of sensory information that you're trying to predict, the so-called proprioceptive information about muscle sort of tensions and distributions of bodily parts. It's the stuff that carries information about how your body is distributed in space. So you predict a flow, another process of evolving proprioceptive states, and then you get rid of the prediction errors that occur because you're not yet moving that way by, you guessed it, moving that way. So when we learn to perform a complex action, that's what we're learning to do if these accounts are right. We're learning what the flow of sensation would be if we were performing the action right. And then brains are very good at getting rid of prediction errors, and so they can then bring the action about. I think this fits very well, actually, with an awful lot of sports psychology, for example, that, we're often told when we're learning, I don't know, well, it's my experience, at least, when I'm learning anything in a sport like a golf swing or a tennis, a shot in tennis, is once you know what it feels like to be doing it right, then it becomes an awful lot easier to do it. The big hump in learning seems to be somehow getting it into you at some sense of what it feels like to be doing it right. Once you've appreciated that once, then you're really on the road to installing expertise properly.
That's
so, this is treating perception and action using exactly the same tools, the same flow of information. It's not that information is kind of flowing, if you like, one way in perception and the other way in action. The only difference is what's being predicted. Proprioceptive information in one case and other information in the other case. This is kind of lovely for me as a long-term fan of embodied cognition. I've long argued, drawing on work by huge numbers of other people in this field, that the sciences of mind have just underestimated the importance of bodily motion and bodily action in the construction of thought, all the way from, using sticky notes to counting on your fingers, or gesturing as you talk. Lots of interesting work suggesting that the gesturing helps your thinking along. Well, I think these accounts are very helpful by giving us a kind of single currency in which perception and action would be jointly constructed moment by moment. So I think they're good for embodied cognition. We'll come to extended cognition later, probably, perhaps, if we dare. And yeah, so that's what.
Let's just.
One more thing about action and perception. Let me just throw this in. Sorry, I just forgot. It's useful, maybe historically, to locate that against the sort of idea motor, so-called idea motor views that were espoused by James and others. And the kind of idea there is that it's somehow the idea of the action that brings the action about. It's the idea of the completed action that brings the action about. I think that these predictive processing accounts of action are in that ballpark. This is just a way of unpacking what it is for the idea of the action to bring the action about. It's the idea of the proprioceptive trajectory that is the action, that brings the action about.
Yeah, that is really nice. It's one of the most elegant features, I think, of the approach. Just to re-emphasize that point about error, the role of error in this picture, because it's very important, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it's something like this, is it? That what perception is giving us, perception is used to update this model that we're creating, this dynamic model of the world, and when that model conflicts with the incoming perceptual data, well, there are two things we can do, right? We can update the model if we're trying to model the world as it is independently of our activity, or we can do something to bring the world into conformity with the model. We can act so as to make the world fit the model. So this direction of fit, whether we're trying to fit the model to the world or the world to the model, in each case we're using the incoming perceptual stream as the data to do that. Is that basically it?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. So it's the same process with, if you like, a different direction of fit. In the case of action, we're bringing about the states of affairs that our brains predict. In the case of perception, we're trying to find out what the states of affairs is, given that our brains are in the state they are and the incoming streams are the way they are. So yeah, same thing, different direction of fit. Long debates about what this does to the belief desire framework.
Yes.
Deep down, if we ever want to go there, my view on that is that it shows that the notion of belief and the notion of desire are both dispensable in a certain way. I think they're very useful at the level at which we ordinarily think of ourselves and engage with others. Very handy. I'm not suggesting we get rid of them. But if you dig down into the machinery, I think what you find are different kinds of prediction that have different kinds of fit, and that understanding that solves a few problems, like, well, so how do these beliefs and desires get together in just the right way to bring about the effects that they do? There was never a good account, really, of how they got together. Whereas if there's nothing to get together because they're all in the same currency to begin with, a lot of that goes away. So.
Well, I like that. Yes. So intentional stance is okay, but subpersonal cognitive psychology, we probably eliminate belief desire from that. I'd be.
I think so. Yeah, I think that you. I think so. Although this is actually, interestingly, this is something that is somewhat contested even within the predictive processing framework. So maybe I belong slightly on the austere edge, where I kind of think, we should just recognize the entities that are actually doing the obvious work.
I think
then you get the kind of austere picture that I'm offering.
I think
versus others that say, but
Sorry, Philip.
Hi, Philip.
I'm going to ring the press now and say Andy Clark doesn't think anyone believes anything. And it's going to be headline news.
Exactly.
I'm only joking. That was
exactly
really
Not only that,
fascinating.
he doesn't even believe that he has beliefs. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to get on. I'd like to get on to some of the to the embodied part, and also to some of the implications and applications of this framework. I think there's just one more piece of machinery we need to introduce, which is very important to the framework, and that's the notion of precision weighting, because that seems to be kind of crucial to getting this this framework to apply flexibly and effectively. So could you say something about that?
Yeah.
Please.
Yes. So at the very outset, I said something like, nothing in experience is ever constructed raw, whatever that would have meant. Instead, it arises at the meeting point of sensory evidence and waves of prediction. But I also said that meeting point is itself, in a sense, I was going to say unstable. It's flexible. The meeting point is flexible. The meeting point is determined by the brain's estimations of what's called precision. Precision is, roughly speaking, the brain's estimation of how reliable the current waves of sensory evidence are, or the predictions are, or these little bits of the sensory evidence, but not those, and these little bits of prediction, but not those. So it's a weighting that is calculated all the time in every brain region for everything that's going on, according to predictive processing. This makes brains essentially second order machines. They're most of the power and flexibility of human cognition, if this is right, comes from this second order nature, that we're not just estimating the world, we're estimating the goodness or reliability of our own estimating machinery moment by moment. Is it a foggy day? Am I in the shower? How reliable is that visual or auditory signal? Is this an area I know really well? Am I really confident in my prediction that the road is going to make a sharp left turn after this bend? Or am I not that confident of that? These things make a huge difference in experience. They structure what pops out at you in experience. If I assign high precision weighting to, for example, my expectation of, let's say, bright pink, then things like this are going to jump out at me from my environment. If I think I wrote something down on a sticky note, but I misremember the color of the note, and it's a perfectly good bright yellow sticky note, it's amazing how easy it is to miss it. Think about when you lose your car keys, but you've forgotten the color of your fob, the key fob, because you changed it recently. You could be looking for ages at the desk in front of you. It's right in front of you, but you don't see it. On these accounts, that's because your brain has assigned high precision, high reliability to an expectation about a vivid color. And it's all of the search and action activity is kind of predicated on that. And so the world is not able to do the job you want it to do, not very easily anyway.
So it's ignoring
So
those
there
bits
are
of
lots of other examples. Yeah.
sorry. So it's ignoring
Sorry,
those bits
Keith, go
of
ahead.
sensory input that don't meet its prediction. It's expecting this color, and
Yeah.
the,
So
the
I was going to
shape.
say, I was going to throw in another. Exactly, I was going to throw in another example that is used a lot in this literature. Two more examples, because examples are good. One is the so-called hollow mask illusion. Some people will know this. It's where you get a joke shot mask. I've got one, but I'd have to unpack a suitcase in the corner of the room to get it out, so I won't do that. But you get a joke shot mask, and you turn it around so the concave side is facing you, and you illuminate it from behind, retire to about 4 foot away, and it will look as if the convex side is facing you. It will look as if the nose is pointing out, and it's a convex face structure. Seems to be because we've had so much experience with the convexity of faces and faces are so important to us, that there's just a deep set prediction of convexity, so that if you get little bits of information that says it's a face, then the faceness and convexness in the context of faceness has such high precision that the other perfectly good information coming at you that is specifying concavity is just treated as noise and ignored. So
I think
there are lots and lots of, there's loads of cases out there where basically illusions are generated by messing with our predictions about what's most likely to be out there.
and I think
I'll stick with that one example because that's enough for now.
I think this leads us very nicely, I think, in one of perhaps the most important practical applications of this framework, which is thinking about certain sorts of illness, which we might tend to classify as mental illness. But one of the implications of this picture is that that's not this contrast between mental illness and bodily illness. It doesn't really stand up, and that predictive processing gives us a new understanding of what's happening in these cases and about its neurological basis. So could you say something about that?
I'd be delighted to, because preface to that, of course, I'm not a clinician. So anything that I say that has clinical cases in it is just the opinion of a well-informed philosopher that hangs out with clinicians. But yeah, the neurological psychiatric divide is something that I think is going to go away. I think this is just an artifact of the time that we happen to live in, and history of thinking about the mind until now. Really, I think that what these pictures suggest is that all of these things are neurological problems. But when neurological problems are problems with the precision weighting mechanisms that we've just been talking about, then they can be so strange in many ways and hard to treat and sort of elusive that we've just labeled that whole set of things. Oh, that's something else, that's psychiatric stuff. Um, so think about think about the precision weighting sort of task. It's trying to balance sensory evidence against the brain's sort of hidden expectations. So it's also worth saying these aren't really quite your expectations. These are the expectations that you probably don't or might not seriously say you have expectations about the convexity of faces or anything like that, but your brain has learnt these things over time. So it's the brain's expectations, something we can argue about later if we need to, that are at issue. And when those expectations involve precision assignments, which they always do, but in cases where the precision assignments are aimed at something bodily, for example, I might assign very, very high precision to an expectation that I'm going to feel a certain kind of buzzing, for example. So classic case here is phantom phone vibrations. Probably most of us at some point have had the experience of feeling as if our phone is going off in our pocket when it really isn't. Maybe you've put the phone on the table or you've turned it off, whatever. You have a very clear sensation of buzzing away in your pocket, but there's nothing there. I get this sensation now on my wrist thanks to wearing an Apple Watch as well. It's like I get phantom signals on my wrist too. So what's going on there on these accounts is that some brains have become, if you like, chronic predictors of buzzing, particularly if you're expecting an important phone call, surprise, surprise, and you become a chronic predictor of buzzing. Equally, though, if you're in a high stress environment, so young doctors get extremely high amounts of phantom vibrations. And also, if you've had not enough sleep or too much caffeine, things that mess with the dopaminergic system, amongst others, that seems to be part of the sort of underlying implementation of the precision weighting regimes. So in effect, what these things are all saying is, I very strongly expect to be feeling this in my body. I've probably got maybe some very low grade signal, but nothing that really ought to be pushing me to think that my phone's going off. But under those conditions, that all gets amplified. You have a strong and clear sensation of the phone going off. This happens clearly to ordinary people. There's nothing, terribly atypical about that. But now imagine that you have something like that going on with respect to something else, like a very strong expectation that you're going to have a pain in your big toe. If somehow that expectation just really got lodged in there, an unconscious, neurologically rooted expectation of certain kinds of signaling coming from that region, well, in just the same way as the phantom phone vibration, your brain can construct that experience out of whole cloth, if you like. And a lot of so-called functional neurological disorders, which are basically neurological disorders for which they cannot find any good structural explanation in the sort of slow timescale structural stuff you can look at in the brain. Lots of cases like that. You can get blindness, paralysis. All of these things exist as cases of FND, and many of those cases will be ones in which there is no structural cause of the standard kind. Of course, there's a cause. If these accounts are right, there's a physical cause. It's not a standard structural cause. Instead, it's this precision weighting thing going wrong within a system which is otherwise perhaps entirely 100% normal. So that's, I think, what pushes us towards this diagnosis. Is often very unhelpful, because when people are diagnosed with functional neurological disorders, they often think that they're just being told that it's all in their head. But well, it's all experience is all in your head in that sense.
Yeah.
That experience is no more in their head than any other experiences. It's all constructed in the same way. It's just that the construction process is operating slightly differently in that case.
And the experience itself is
So
exactly.
very interesting work.
So-
Well, that's a very good question, and I honestly don't know the answer to that, because it could be that in a very, let's say, in an ordinary case of a strong pain in the big toe. This is not a real example. I'm just making this one up for ease and caricature. But it might be that the pattern of signals that you get in that case is kind of subtly different to the pattern of signals that you get when you just have a strong expectation of that pattern, because you might not know exactly, your brain might not know exactly what pattern that is, but it's in the ballpark. So I think we can't quite answer the question, are these experiences exactly the same as they would be otherwise? But the main thing, I think, is, well, they're genuine experiences of blindness, pain, paralysis. And I think of maybe even more interest, ultimately, to me at least, is the idea that all our experience of medical symptoms is actually a combination of some of that kind of stuff and other stuff. So experiences of cancer-related fatigue, experiences of breathlessness with asthma, experiences of discomfort with atrial fibrillation. The list kind of goes on, and the amount of variation across individuals for what seems to be the same amount of kind of basic structural issue is huge. And not only that, variation within the same individual at different times is also huge. And I think what's going on there is that we, over time, we construct edifices of expectation that structure our experiences of pain and discomfort and disability, even when there are perfectly good structural causes at work as well. And so it's a mixture of that kind. And perhaps it will be useful, I think, to appreciate that. And I think that will help remove some of the apparent stigma from the more pure functional neurological disorders, where there doesn't seem to be anything structurally related going on, a standard classical slow moving structure.
I think that's really interesting, because it suggests these are just on a continuum with all cases of distress. All distress is a mixture of those kinds of anomalous stimulation and our construction of experience on the basis of it. And one of the other things that you talk about a bit in the book is that this also offers hope of new ways of addressing these kinds of distress by trying to help to restructure the way that people interpret their experience, or interpret their bodily sensations, I guess.
Yes, that's right. So there are various cases here. A simple case of reinterpretation might be just framing and reframing your own experience. So often before I go on stage or do a big talk, I feel sort of tingles in my fingers, adrenaline type tingles, I've actually found it helpful to reframe that as chemical readiness to deliver a good performance. Because, if you frame it as, oh, I'm very nervous today, that's not very conducive to a good performance. But chemical readiness to really go for it is. So that's just a simple reframing. But words and language are very powerful tools for that sort of thing. In more complex cases like chronic pain, which is something I talk about a fair bit in the book, it looks as if part of what's going on in chronic pain is that a system that is normally doing a lot of good things, which is stopping you doing things that will damage you if you do. So, if I fall over and twist an ankle, then the fact that I feel a lot of pain and it stops me putting pressure on that ankle is a very good thing, because you'll make it a lot worse if you do. But in a lot of cases of chronic pain, chronic back pain is a good example, and one rather close to home since I've suffered from that. In chronic back pain, it looks as if what's going on a lot of the time is that even where there is some structural cause, the variation across individuals and within yourself can be so great that your own deep set predictions of inability to do certain things without pain are playing a big role. They're kind of actually holding you back from producing the behaviors that your brain could then learn from. And so there's a thing called pain reprocessing theory, which for certain kinds of chronic pain is doing quite well. There are some big studies on chronic back pain. That's why I used that example, suggesting that this reprocessing approach is quite powerful, better than placebo, sort of randomized, controlled, double-blind sort of studies. So pretty gold standard, large numbers of participants. And what goes on there is really people are, first of all, told stuff about the way that brains construct experience, and then given a few thoughts like, in many cases, though, you can think of pain as a warning light telling you not to do any more. But in these cases, it's a warning light itself, the precision assignments in our deeper sense that are going wrong, and that are themselves the source of the pain that is stopping you doing the things which, if you were to do more of them, you might slowly change your model of yourself. And the interesting thing is that by getting people to do that, they report experiencing less pain as they go along. So it is interesting. It's a bit like if you were told that the warning light is malfunctioning on your car and you should just drive it a bit more anyway, and you keep just driving it a bit more anyway, the warning light gets dimmer. That's a really cool effect. As I say, it's only chronic lower back pain that is well documented right now. But I feel like this approach has some legs and should be explored.
And you also mentioned some really interesting work using virtual reality in this connection into helping people reframe their expectations. I mean, that again is something that I encourage people to study in the book.
Sorry, I was going to say you like floating jellyfish for so burns patients. You can change the dressings of burns patients using a virtual reality sort of display of nice sort of slowly floating, pulsating jellyfish. And people, of course, would have said, well, this is distraction. Distraction is a powerful tool. You're just distracting people from the pain. And in some way, I think that's true. But we now have a better model of what distraction might amount to. Distraction is changing where your put is, changing the model that you're applying, and it's changing the precision with which your other expectations, like expectations of pain, can be held, because your precision weighting is a sort of zero-sum game. If I up the precision on something, I lower it on other stuff. So if I up the precision on the nice undulating jellyfish, I have to lower it on something else, like signals coming from a burn. So it is distraction, but now we understand a bit more about the mechanism of distraction.
That's fantastic. That's fascinating. And there are lots more examples, I should say, in Andy's book, which I encourage everyone to look at. I'm conscious that I need to bring Philip in, but before I do, can we just introduce the second part of the other component, if you like, of the story here, which is the extended mind? Because we've been talking a lot about what the brain is doing. The brain's creating this model. The brain's updating this model. The brain's monitoring the bodily feedback from the body and so on. The brain's doing all this. It sounds like a very brain-centric model of how this. But one other, well, you're known for many things, but one other thing that you're known for is advocating the view that the mind can extend out of the brain and outside the brain into the body, but outside the body into the surrounding environment. In aspects of the environment can I said mind can actually become part of your mind. And take on mental functions. Now, if you just briefly introduce that, but also say how that fits in with this, what seems to be a brain-centric predictive processing framework. Yeah,
I mean, this one is even harder, if anything, to make plausible in a few words. It is a radical claim. The extended mind idea is that the machinery of mind isn't always just the brain, that sometimes under some conditions, and there's been a lot of ink spilled about what those conditions are, but sometimes under some conditions, stuff that's going on in what appears to be, and indeed is, the outside world, is also part of the machinery of your mental processing. So, for example, perhaps my iPhone is currently part of the machinery of some kinds of processing that I do. Perhaps finding my way around town. Perhaps I've factored the use of the GPS well enough into what my brain is natively doing for it to form a kind of single system for getting around, so that if you wanted to understand what it is that I know in order to get around, then you really ought to think about how these things are working together and not just focus on the brain side contribution. Ditto for things closer to the body, like I mentioned gesture earlier. Interesting work suggesting that if you get kids to sit on their hands while they try to explain how they solved a particular problem, they do a lot worse at explaining that. So a lot of work by Susan Golden Meadow and colleagues showing that as they ended up thinking that in some way the physical gesturing is part of the process that moves the thinking along. So it's as if you're sort of devolving part of the impetus for moving through cognitive space to moving through physical space, dividing up the labor a bit. So there are lots of examples like that. So they eventually convinced me and Dave Chalmers, who were interestingly sort of jointly writing about this, that it was just a kind of prejudice that everything, that the machinery of mind had to be in the head, that even in the human case, let alone weird aliens, but just us, some of the machinery of mind might very well be running in stuff outside the head, very well fitted tools and technologies, broadly speaking. It's possible that language is right on the borderline there. You know, that language is a kind of, it's kind of bio me, but it's also kind of outside of bio, as in biological me. It's kind of, it's stuff, it's structure that I create that then has effects on me. That's a bit like writing in a notebook. So we spent quite a while chasing all that around, and a question that was always left unanswered there was a question of exactly how the right stuff comes together at the right time. So, you know, it might be that I'm solving a problem using pen and paper and, you know, my iPhone, a couple of apps, stuff that's stored in my brain, all of that stuff. It's getting together to solve the problem. How does the right stuff come together at the right time? It's there that I think predictive processing is giving us a major missing piece of the story, because it's because the brain is this uncertainty estimating organ, if you like. So the idea is that in order to try to solve a problem like, I don't know, I want to go and see a movie at the cinema tonight, there'll be stuff that I've stored in biological memory. There'll also be a lot of stuff that I have some uncertainty about. I may be uncertain of the film times or the nearest cinema. I can make a very quick foray into the web to reduce that uncertainty so as to better approach my goals. As an uncertainty estimator, brains estimate the uncertainty of the outside stuff in just the same way as they estimate the certainty or uncertainty of the inner stuff. And they are kind of, what's the word I want? They will automatically, we're getting a little bit into the technicalia here, but the equations of predictive processing have written deeply into them both an epistemic and a practical component. So basically you're trying to gather the information that will enable you to reduce enough uncertainty to get something done, solve a problem, go for a walk, get to the cinema, whatever it happens to be. And in that process, there's no location specificity. There's no extra value given to information just because it's stored in the head rather than in the world. It's the very same process of estimation applied in all of those cases. And because they are information foraging engines as much as just practical doing engines, everything emerges in this sort of continuous flow. So let me just say one more thing here, but you know, this is getting a maybe I shouldn't be saying, so I'm going to say it anyway. When when you dig into this picture, the distinction between what used to be called epistemic actions and practical actions seems to somewhat disappear. So an epistemic action is an action designed to improve your state of information, like looking up something in a notebook. Practical action is something like, walking somewhere. But because they're constructed in the same way, and it's just an uncertainty minimizing engine that is trying to get things done, then the distinction isn't important as far as the brain's concerned anyway. It is just trying to get things done. And if the best thing to do is to walk a bit, great, let's walk. If the best thing to do is to do some mental action, let's think a bit harder. Okay, let's do that. If the best thing to do is to consult the web, okay, let's do that. We now have this fluid model of how those decisions are made and how we flip from what looks on the outside like epistemic to what looks like practical without ever having to calculate whether we should be doing something epistemic or something practical. It's all generated by the ongoing attempt to minimize prediction errors as we approach our goals, which are just highly predicted states. So sorry, yes, that's even when I try and do that in the book, I think it's a bit of a mouthful. But yeah.
So the epistemic actions are, as it were, just little sort of detours we take on the way to where we want to be that are going to help us get there more effectively. You have this example of navigating by the coast rather than taking a direct line, because you can find your way to the destination better that way, even though it's a bit further.
Yes, but although I wouldn't call them quite detours. I mean, they're detours in that very, very physical sense. So, the so-called coastal navigation algorithm is, if you want to find your way to some distant point up the coast, often it's better to just follow the coast, even if you know damn well that there's a straighter route. If only you could find it, it may be a lot better to just, minimize uncertainty by finding the coast, because you can see the coast and then following the coast. That scores very high on the reliable uncertainty minimization scale. And as evolved creatures, I think we like to score high on that scale when things matter, like getting to port in time for a pint or whatever. So yeah.
Right. So with this,
I've forgotten why I'm saying that.
I threw in the word detour, so which took us on a detour.
Yeah.
So the general idea is that this aim of minimizing prediction error is the overarching framework that unifies thinking about planning and about the involvement of the environment. It's that we recruit anything we can to this task, and we as you say, I love that word you use, foraging. We're foraging for things that will help us to do it. And it's no accident that there are these things around us, because we that's why we've made them.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, part of what underlies all this is that the only real reward for brains, for organisms like this, is minimizing prediction error. So anything that minimizes error is a kind of rewarding state. And so gathering information is a very powerful thing to do there. These systems are, as some people put it, they're naturally curious. And so when you want to build a system which is an artificial system, a robot that behaves as if it is curious, one thing that you do is you just make sure that what it wants to do is minimize error all the time. And that, in order to do that, you make your systems attracted to bits of the physical world where they're minimizing more than expected amounts of error. So this is the slope of prediction error minimization. So if you set a little robot up so that it likes a good slope of minimizing prediction error, then it's going to prefer to be in bits of the world that aren't too boring, because you don't get to minimize unexpected bits of prediction error there, and that aren't too difficult, because you can't minimize much prediction error there. So it occupies the sweet spots for learning. These are artificially curious systems. And brains, I think, are naturally curious systems. And this is why, because they're prediction error minimizers, and they like a good slope of prediction error minimization. I think that's why we generate games for ourselves and things like that. They're little artificial domains in which we can get those kicks. Yeah.
It's just occurred to me that this offers I don't think you talk much about this in the book, but it offers the interesting take on misinformation and on the ways in which this fundamental impetus that our brains have can be hijacked and exploited by bad actors.
I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of the misinformation that propagates fast through the web, like, well, conspiracy theories are obviously a prime example. Great thing about conspiracy theories is they would solve a lot of problems all at once. So you would suddenly, if this were true, minimize error in many apparently unrelated domains all at once with one
golden bullet, aren't they? That's a really interesting take. That deserves developing at a great deal more length. I must bring Philip in here because we've been talking about experience, and I'm quite happy with this way of talking about experience. I think it's the only way to talk about it. But I think Philip will think that we've been missing something out of the picture here, possibly. Although maybe he's been converted in the course of the conversation, because Philip is quite into conversion at the moment. Sorry, Philip. I just wonder he might have had a road to Damascus moment in the last half hour.
Well, let's see.
Let's have your
well, you've had the nice words from Keith now, Andy. You ready? Time for the attack dogs.
Okay.
You ready for some challenges? No,
yep.
I'm only joking. No,
I'm raised to the Inquisition.
No, I mean, I absolutely loved the book, and it is really, I mean, I just think it is actually a very promising framework. And what's making me think just from the conversation today is, in some ways, in many ways it's bringing more unity to our understanding of the mind. We've touched on bringing beliefs and desires into one, psychiatry and more mental health more generally into one. I really do think it is a promising framework, and in fact, I think in a real sense, reading the book, I don't think really there's anything I disagree with. And this brings me to the first thing I'd like to ask you, actually. And I'm kind of curious.
That's because I left out the chapter on consciousness. Yeah. Because there was a whole chapter, not just a little interlude. And every time I sent it to my publishers, they said, we can't understand that. That's not going to fly.
Really?
Can't do that.
Okay.
Maybe they were right.
I would like to see that.
So what got left is the hints in the interlude. But yes.
Well, the
thank
interlude
you for the kind words anyway.
No, the interlude was very nicely done. So, but I am wondering how much we do disagree. I mean, it seems to me that the central questions you're focused on are kind of neutral between these metaphysical differences, right? As I understand it, you're interested in the basis of thought and consciousness and other mental states. But even a David Chalmers style dualist still thinks, in some sense, the brain and the workings of the brain are the basis of consciousness, right? It's just we need a little bit extra to make sense of that. So just for viewers who don't know the details of David Chalmers' view, he thinks to fully explain consciousness, we need to postulate these psychophysical laws that kind of bridge the gap between the physical brain and consciousness. So Chalmers thinks if we didn't have these psychophysical laws, we wouldn't be conscious, right? We'd just be zombies. But what these psychophysical laws do is kind of give an extra productive capacity to the brain to make consciousness, right? They kind of bridge the gap. But so I could be a David Chalmers style dualist and totally agree with almost everything you say in your book, that the basis of consciousness is this predictive processing story. I just think we have to add these psychophysical laws to really get consciousness out of that. But still, I could agree with you that the basis of thought and consciousness is this predictive processing story. So do you think it matters, these metaphysical differences, for what's important to your project?
Yeah, it's a good question. See, I think that what Dave would have to say is that this account is perhaps a very good account of the contents of consciousness. That's to say, the stuff that I report when I report, to take the most brutal version, but also the stuff that seems to me to be going on when things seem to me to be going on. The thing is that then, if someone thinks that in order to get real experience out of that way of structuring content, you need to add something extra, and that something extra goes beyond what can be explained or cashed out in physical terms, then I think we do part company. Deep down, I don't think that there's a need for the little bit extra that you mentioned, because that little bit extra seems to me to be an awful lot extra. It's supposed to be the thing that takes you from, here's a structured description of the world, to here's a structured description of the world that is actually experienced by a creature when they encounter their worlds and themselves. So although it's super, super speculative, I am very much in what I think is the Keith Frankish ballpark for this. It's a kind of Frankish Dennett sort of line, and it relates to what Dave Chalmers himself calls the meta problem, the meta hard problem, which is the problem of why we think there's a hard problem at all. I think predictive processing has things to say about that, because you can, if you start to ask the question, what happens when creatures turn up in their own predictive models, where this turning up has to be, for now, bereft of experiential or phenomenological readings. It's just, you've got a model of the world, just like ChatGPT has, but hey, in this case, you're part of your model of the world as well. I think an awful lot of our puzzlement about consciousness arises because we're part of our own model of the world, but we've got a very simplified model of ourselves, one that is kind of handy for most of what we want it to do, but it populates our own experience with things like sort of tastes and smells and sounds, when there are real distinctions that I make in the realms of taste and smell and sound, but it's not that taste and smell and sound are exactly entities. The experience, taste and smell and sound. I think what we do is we infer that there is this realm of puzzling experiences, because we're using a highly simplified self model to predict ourselves and other people. So if that were right, then the real question is, how do you build a robot that will infer that it has these kinds of puzzling conscious states on top of doing all the stuff that you need to do, like, getting around in the world, avoiding stuff that is going to damage you and so on. So I guess deep down, my take on consciousness is there's something real there, and there's something kind of unreal or illusory there. The real thing is that we have all this interoceptive information flowing all the time from our own body. We have information about how we're going to act. We have information coming from the world. And when all of that crunches together, you get estimations of salience and action. What's important? What am I going to do about it? I think that that's what the core of consciousness, and that's something that is shared, of course, with many, many non-human animals. Language is just icing on that cake. It's not the core of it. But once you've got a certain level of self-modeling, then you end up sort of having to have a rich picture of yourself, and the rich picture that you develop is full of these rather dubious entities, like experiences that nonetheless don't seem to be clearly anchored in physical stuff. Therefore, maybe we need to add the extra sparkle or sprinkle to our account. So I guess I think there's something real there, but there's also a puzzle that is merely an illusion, and it's an illusion of self-modeling. And I suspect that means that you and I, Philip, disagree on that bit, even though you could take a lot of the rest of it, because suppose you take your sprinkle, then that's fine. You can add your extra thing, and then you've just got some machinery that it might be useful to think about, might be handy for some kinds of intervention, and so on. Maybe it's a good way of intervening on experience itself. It's just that experience itself requires the extra. So I can see that. It's a perfectly coherent position. There are good reasons to think it might be true. And I'm just still on the illusionist side of that bit of the equation. But it's not that, and maybe, I don't know whether Keith and I agree or disagree here. I don't think that quite means that consciousness is an illusion. I think it just means that some of the questions that we ask ourselves about consciousness are best avoided because they're not really latching onto anything out there that we need to worry about. Instead, we need to answer the sort of meta-hard problem. Yeah, sorry, Keith.
I certainly don't want to say that consciousness is an illusion. I try to be careful about that. It's this sprinkle.
I thought you did.
But I think we could all agree, though, that we have a sort of sense of salience of things, of the affordances of things, of the way things matter to us, and that this is a kind of, it's sort of inchoate. We can't put up, but it's very powerful. We sense that certain things are really meaningful for us in good ways, bad ways, whatever. And this is a very powerful sense that we can't really articulate, that moves us deeply, and so we can all agree on that. And Andy, you've got a story about how that sense is constructed, and I love the way you talk about predicting our own predicting. I think that extra that meta element of prediction may be crucial to getting this story working. But you've got to, whereas Philip thinks no, it's just got to be taken at face value as it is, and it can't be mechanized in that way or mechanically explained in that way. But we're all focusing, I think, on the same sense that we have. It's just what we do with that intuition. I mean, Dan Dennett thought that it helped the zombic hunch. But anyway,
we can all agree.
I agree.
There is, we can all agree that there is a neural basis to consciousness, and we need to do the scientific philosophical work to establish what that is. I think Andy's got a very promising proposal on that. But then it's just filling in the metaphysical details to how that neural basis gets to do it. Is it because there are these extra psychophysical laws? Is it because there's consciousness at the root of the neural basis? But I think it is important to distinguish those two things. But anyway, let's get to the heart of the argument. So actually, I am a little bit upset with you, Andy, because you've come on and you seem to have completely forgotten that it's an important anniversary for us this year. That it's 10 years since we debated the knowledge argument, right? 10 years ago on this infamous boat in a sailing ship, this bizarre, fascinating, wonderful consciousness event of a kind of conference.
10 years.
A conference
10
of
years.
a dozen philosophers on a sailing
That means it's
ship.
that means it. That's a very good reminder. That means it's my 10th wedding anniversary. This is good to.
Oh, really?
Of course. Yes,
Don't forget that anniversary. But yeah, I remember on this sailing ship going around the Arctic, we had a good debate about the knowledge argument. So I thought, as our 10th anniversary present, I could press that on you again and see if you think the same things. So yeah, with the knowledge argument, I never understand why we need this bizarre fantasy story about Mary who's somehow never seen colors, never seen her own blood or anything. We could just take a blind neuroscientist, right? And I don't think it's necessary for the argument actually that they have to know absolutely everything physical that's going on in the brain, right? Let's just imagine a blind from birth neuroscientist who's followed your work, read all your papers, knows this predictive processing story of what's going on in the brain, right? That's the setup. There's a strong intuition for many of us that there's still some information they're lacking, some crucial information about consciousness, about the nature of consciousness that they're lacking, namely the qualitative character of color experience, what it's like to see red, what it's like to see green, that qualitative character. So for people pressing this argument, there's something that your predictive processing story, wonderful as it is missing out. There's some information it's missing out, some information that it can't convey to this congenitally blind neuroscientist, namely the qualitative character of color experience. So what do you say to that? Is there some information that's missing from your theory?
Yeah, I don't think there's information missing from the theory just because reading the theory doesn't give you the experience, because that's roughly what that comes down to. Roughly what that comes down to is I can understand the theory, but I'm not having the experience. But suppose that experience is constructed the way predictive processing thinks it's constructed, by having flows of sensory information that are met by flows of prediction. Well, if you're not getting the right flows of sensory information, or if you're not able to generate the right flows of prediction, then you're not going to be able to construct that experience. Reading about how the experience is constructed won't actually construct it. So that
Yeah, no,
sort of, this kind of the theory itself is not its own implementation. It's a depiction, and what you need to be is the implementation of the theory. So I think that the strong prediction of the theory is if you built something that did this, then it would have experiences just as we do. It would say and do the things we say and do, and it would evince puzzlement in the ways that we evince puzzlement. It would perhaps have this argument. So that's the way that I go with that. It's just wrong to expect knowing the theory to do that sort of work. I can know a theory of baseball, but not know how to hit a baseball.
Well, I agree with everything you said then. I think that's maybe not quite the right way to see the argument. Yeah, of course,
Okay.
reading the theory won't give you the experience, right? Reading about black holes won't turn you into a black hole. But what reading about black holes ought to give you is all the information about the essential nature of black holes, right? If you've got a supposed theory of black holes that leaves something out, leaves out some crucial information. What's some crucial information? Stephen Hawking had that thing about them radiating or something. I can't remember what that is though. But if it leaves out some information, it's not a complete theory of black holes. Likewise, if you've got a complete theory of color experience, yeah, reading it shouldn't give you the experience, but it should give you all the information. There should be no information you're missing, but there is information you're missing about
And
the
perhaps that's
essential
true. Perhaps there
nature of
is no information. I think it's hard to know exactly how to go at that point, but I think what I want to say is that actually I don't have to say that there's information missing from the theory. I just say what I just said, that reading the theory won't give you the experience, but all the information is there in the theory. The theory perfectly well explains and predicts the shape of the experience that you're not actually having because you don't instantiate the theory. I mean, you can you can sometimes do this by thinking about the way that we represent things to ourselves in experience. That what's missing is, if you like, a certain kind of self-representation there that sort of glues the experience to you at that moment. But I think that's what I want to say. I'm going to say the information is there. Just because reading the theory doesn't produce the experience doesn't mean the information's not there. Why do you say the information's not there?
Yeah, good
Because it
comeback.
doesn't give you the experience. But we go around in a circle at that point, and I'm not
Well,
sure how
let me
to
have
stop the top spinning.
let me have one more go, and then you can have the
Right.
final word on it. One way of trying to press that there's some information missing is the colorblind neuroscientist, the blind neuroscientist we've been talking about, might be curious about what it's like to see red, the qualitative character of a red experience. I wonder what that's like. And they might still be curious even after they've read all your theory and so on. Let's say one day, and so we're coming closer to the classic Mary case, one day they have an operation and they actually have the experience. Their curiosity might be satisfied. They might go, oh my gosh, that's what it's like. That's the character of the experience. It seems their curiosity is satisfied. And doesn't that seem to suggest that there is some information they were lacking when they just knew your theory, and some information they've gained now they've had the experience? And so there is some information there that's not being that is missing from your theory. But it's a curiosity-based argument.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I see the shape of the argument. I think one way to reply to it might be to say that curiosity there is really curiosity about a route to the information, if you like. That the theory gives you one route to the information. It's a perfectly good route to the information, but until you get the information via another route, which is actually crunching together sensory evidence and expectation in just the way that the theory requires, then you've not got to that information in the same way. It's not that there's new information, it's just a route to the old information. That's, I think that's, see, that none of this bothers me as much as I think it quite rightly, I suppose, bothers you, because I think that these arguments themselves, the fact that we're engaging in these arguments, is a sort of reflection of the kind of illusory layers in our picture of consciousness. It's because we have this sort of picture of conscious experience as something very, very, very different to anything that can be adequately explained by a set of evolving differential equations or something like that. We have that intuition because of the simplified self models that we bring to bear on our own life and world. So I want to say that the intuitions that are driving the line of questioning that you've got are themselves somehow rooted in that misguided model. But I can't quite prove it, even to myself, as it were. I'm not quite, my self-estimated confidence in how this debate ought to go at this point is very low. So
No.
I'm not assigning high precision to my
I
own
think
moves in this debate at
Well,
this
I
point.
mean, these things are famously hard to demonstratively establish and build consensus. But what I did like about your book is, yeah, so for readers who haven't yet read it, there is this wonderful interlude book where there is this wonderful interlude bit where you deal with these philosophical challenges and you develop this explanation of why you think we're under this illusion that consciousness is more than physical or something. And so it's not just, people like Keith Frankish or something who say it's an illusion. You're giving an explanation. No, I'm joking. Keith gives explanations too, but it was a fascinating attempt to try and explain that intuition.
Yeah, and the really exciting thing is that predictive processing might have the resources to give us that.
There we go.
I think
Maybe
it
I'll be
might. I
convinced.
think it might. There's serious work that needs to be done, but I think it might. The other thing that I think might happen is you just live with a theory for a long time that actually enables you to do a lot of cool stuff, like intervening on human experience, predicting the shape of psychological remedies and disorders that we haven't yet encountered, understanding how neurotypical and atypical experience are on a continuum. Live with something like that for long enough, and maybe our intuitions about the existence of the need for the extra sprinkle, if you like, will just disappear. It'll, our own self model will change enough to make those extra questions drop out again. That's a hope that I might have.
Yeah, Dan would have loved that point. It's
Maybe.
exactly how he would have put it.
We will see. Well, we have some questions from, if you've got a few more minutes, Andy, we have some questions we've gathered on
cool. Sure.
Twitter, or X as they call it these days. Question from David Matter. How does the extended mind theory relate to our interactions with AI? Could AI be an extension of our cognition? What do you think?
Yes is the answer. Yes, it's a very clear yes. I think the future of human intelligence is very much a sort of synergy between what the biological systems are doing and what the AIs can do. So I do expect an awful lot of extended mind cases there. It's one of these sorts of cases where in order to get the easiest versions of the extended mind story, the stuff that is becoming part of the extended system normally doesn't have that much agency of its own. You know, the iPhone's got a certain amount of agency, but not a lot. Pen and paper, definitely not much agency going on there, not in the notepad, Otto's notepad. The sophisticated AIs will have quite a lot of what you might think of as agency in some very broad sense. They are more like collaborations with other people than they're like collaborations with a standard tool. But just as we've always argued that you can sometimes collaborate with other people in ways that make stuff going on in their heads count for some problem solving episodes as activities of your mind, I think that bit of the picture will apply just as well to advanced AIs. They will be behaving like other people in that respect. And then less advanced ones may be even more apt for the extended mind treatment in some way, because they'll be a bit more like a kind of semi-passive tool.
It could also have very worrying aspects to it, though. If our minds become extended into artifacts that themselves have a measure of agency, then, and unlike other humans, we don't have all the social structures and practices that we use to negotiate these relations. That we can imagine a dystopian world in which our minds become hijacked and manipulated by parts of themselves. Which,
yes, I think that's right. I mean, this already happens sometimes just in the sort of biological parts, if you like, where something which is not in my overall best interest nonetheless takes over, like an addictive compulsion or something like that, and it would be rather like that. What we need to do is, I think, realizing that kind of threat will just make us more careful about how we slowly build these what will be nested ecosystems of intelligence in the end. We are built in many ways of smaller intelligences. There's a sense in which our gut is a kind of minor intelligence. The brain is full of minor intelligences. I think nesting intelligences within intelligences is actually what biological cognition and biological life somehow is all about. This sort of nesting of skill. And we need to recognize that the AI infrastructures that we are currently building are big parts of a newly evolving nested intelligence, of which we're going to be other parts. So that should make us cautious and careful, and maybe also appreciative. If that could be done right, it could just be a wonderful and empowering.
Yeah. We get another
okay,
question.
we have another question from Pete Mandick, who's going to be on the Mind Chat show next month. Pete asks if 1990s connectionist Andy could see what's been going on with LLMs the past half decade, what would he feel vindicated by, and what would he feel surprised by? Also, Pete says hi.
Yeah, hi Pete. Lovely to hear from you. I will definitely tune in when you're the extravaganza. Yeah, what would early artificial neural networks, Andy? My first book, 1989, Microcognition. Parallel distributed processing and the microstructure of intelligence, or something like that. But mostly a kind of vindication that as we've continued to model ourselves, that the principles of early artificial neural networks don't really seem to have gone away. They've obviously there've been enormous sort of growth and extensions, kind of all these transformer networks that people are using now are very powerful things that were not part of the early landscape there. Nonetheless, I don't think I think the thing I'm amazingly surprised at how far you can get with what are in effect amped up versions of the old algorithms. Just more processing speed, more power, more data has just enabled systems to cross thresholds of performance that I would never in a million years have anticipated they could cross. I would have thought that brand new ideas in computational space would have been necessary to get that far. And this is kind of this is both a kind of wonderful thing, but also a kind of burden, because I think the fact that you can get that far just by tweaking those systems and giving them more and more sort of more power and more fodder. It may be blinding us to the fact that you actually need to do something a bit different if you're going to reproduce anything like fluid intelligence that has a real sense of the world that it's part of. So in order to do that, I think we do need to look a bit harder in what is, roughly speaking, predictive process in space, in a space that is structured around action and significance as opposed to data. And that I think is where the new models in predictive processing world are pointing. Let's think hard about action and significance, and not think that you can really solve the problem of generating real understanding just by amplifying those older approaches. So I think that would be right. So that's what's surprising, and also what's sort of slightly worrying at times. Thank you, Pete.
That was a great answer.
Okay, we've got one final question from Ben Schutz. Given the failures in error connections we see in schizophrenics, would Andy be a proponent for a path whereby your sensory predictions could be improved with Neuralink BCI devices rather than drug interdictions? Interdictions, is that the right word? Or is that a typo?
Interventions?
Interventions, I guess, yes. I was wondering whether that was a technical term I didn't know, but interventions, I guess he meant.
That's a very hard question to end on, because there's a lot going on there, and I'm not quite sure if I don't think I fully understand the alternative proposal. It seems to me that that drug interventions are a very, very, very blunt tool for dealing with schizophrenia, which is itself a very, very, very blunt label for what's a huge space of individual difference. So one thing that I think is going to come out of the predictive processing approaches to computational psychiatry is a much more nuanced appreciation of those sorts of spaces. I've sometimes said we might end up with something a bit like a periodic table of mental variation, where you can sort of see that different sorts of precision weighting, checks and balances in different parts of the brain give you these subtle differences, where within the broad box of schizophrenia, there are probably huge numbers of differences, some subtle, some not so subtle. So I think understanding will be a big outcome. If we did have that sort of understanding, then maybe things like brain-machine interfaces applied just right and in the, could really be part of a solution. Another thing that does come out of these approaches is that the environment is so important that actually we should never ignore the power of environmental change and restructuring to make huge differences, because the way that we do these precision weighting strategies, if you like, is very much by taking on board an awful lot of impetus from the environment. And so I think we need things that are more personalized, that are more environmentally sensitive, and that probably will involve drugs as well, but drugs that are much more sort of precision engineered for the person and the environment in which they're going to function. And if these approaches can in some way inform part of that, then all the better. And if brain-machine interfaces can play a role there, then yeah, bring them on board. So sounds like an interesting area.
Thanks a lot, Andy. I think this has been for me at least, a very stimulating and informative discussion. I think I really learned a lot from your work, and we're very, very grateful for you coming on to chat to us today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Likewise, learned a lot from both of you.
Well, I think there are lots of disagreements between us, particularly with me. Everyone always disagrees with me. But I think, at the core of all this, the important thing we can all agree at the end of the day is that, importantly, crucially, consciousness is wherever it is.
And nowhere else.
And it's not what we expected it to be either.